My name is Carol Bosley. I'm a member of the League of Women Voters, and I'm also a member of the Braver Angels East Central Illinois Alliance. I welcome everyone to this Keeping It Local program, and I especially welcome the non-league members. Our Keeping It Local programs are a monthly program that we have to discuss local issues, and we invite a local speaker to talk to us. This month's issue, which is political divisiveness, is very important to the League of Women Voters because we are a nonpartisan group, and we're very concerned about the polarization as the current climate that is existing. A month ago, we had a town hall building a House United, and it was co-sponsored by the campus, the League of Women Voters, the Braver Angels, East Central Illinois Alliance, and the News Gazette. As we were planning it, we were expecting 100 people, and that evening, close to 200 people attended. At the I Hotel, they kept bringing in chairs, and the room was overflowing. Last week, we had our first Braver Angels Alliance meeting after the town hall. Typically, we have 7 to 8 people attend that meeting. Last week, we had 33 people attend that meeting, and at least 8 to 10 wanted to attend, but they were on spring break. I tell you that story because I think it just demonstrates how concerned we are in this community about the political divisiveness. At the town hall, one of our panelists was Scott Althouse. In fact, he was a very well-received panelist, and on the evaluations, more than 100 people returned their evaluation, which is a really very high rate. But anyway, on the evaluations, people said, I want to hear more from Scott Althouse. So Sarah and I invited him to attend this Keeping It Local, and we are so grateful that he said yes to us, even though it's the week after spring break, and we know how busy professors are the week after spring break. So we're so grateful Scott said yes to us. Scott is a professor of communications and poli-sci at the University of Illinois. He is the director of the Klein Center for Advanced Social Research. He graduated from Northwestern University. I think in the 1990s, I don't know exactly when you graduated, Scott, but you came to Champaign-Urbana in the 1990s. So you are not only a local person, by now you're almost a townie. Yes. So Scott will say a few words, and then a brief presentation, and then after that we will have Q&A, and Sarah Kelly will moderate the Q&A. Sarah is a member of the League of Women Voters and also a member of the Braver Angels East Central Illinois Alliance. So given all that, I think at this time I will again thank Scott for being here this evening and turning it over to him. Scott?
Thanks so much, Carol. And it's great to see some familiar faces and names in this crowd. It's a very distinguished group, and it's a real honor to be invited to speak here on a topic that's a very difficult one for us right now. And so I want to say that the topic of talking about politics across lines of difference is not a research specialty of mine, but it is something that I have come into over 27 years as a political science professor, but also some other parts of my background that gave me some life experience to try to think differently, maybe about how to speak across lines of difference than we tend to hear out of the major news outlets today. I also have developed research interests in public opinion and media and politics, and just larger political trends in the United States that are bringing us to the point where we are today. So I'm happy to answer any questions that people may have that would be related to those topics. But I was asked to speak a little bit about how what are some tactics that we could use to speak with people who have very different political views from our own, and who may not be too amenable to having a conversation about those differences. And my thinking got a little consolidated as we were heading into the 2020 presidential election, which was memorable for being very divisive. And I helped prepare a little video that the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences put out that gave some tips. So I can summarize what I said in that video, and maybe that will be useful for some of you in thinking through how to approach difficult conversations. The main point, if there's one sort of takeaway point of what I'm bringing to this topic, it is based on my experience, again, not on academic research so much. But if you're trying to win that conversation, you're going to lose. And I think that's the main takeaway point. And the first of 4 tactics that I would suggest can be useful for trying to avoid a losing outcome in a difficult conversation is the skill of listening, and not the skill of listening for advantage. Like, I want to hear what things my conversation partner are saying, so that I can quickly come up with my comebacks and my what about this is and all of that. If I'm listening in that way, typically in these polarized times, that conversation is going to go south pretty quickly. But there's another stance that I could choose as a conversation partner to take, and it is one that is not easy to take. I can assure you of that. But that is not listening for advantage, but listening for understanding. And so this is a conversational stance that you, as a partner in this conversation, have to choose to take on for yourself. It's not anything that's going to come naturally or easily to either start with that stance or to maintain it through a difficult conversation. And what that means is, temporarily, if you're able, putting on hold your right to emotionally react to what is being brought up, and your desire to demonstrate that your view is better or different, or at least more plausible than the one that you're hearing, and to simply stop and focus so intently on what the person is saying that by listening well and being able to articulate back to the person what you're hearing, you can say back to the person what they're saying to you in a way that convinces them that you've heard them so well that you can summarize back to them what they said. And that's a deep kind of listening. Now, that isn't going to get you to the point where you can begin having a conversation about differences. But if you're listening for understanding rather than advantage, it is going to set you up to be able to move into a phase. Maybe it's in this conversation, maybe it's in a subsequent conversation with the same person, where you're going to see where the entry points are in the common space that is shared between you and your conversation partner, that would allow for an exploration of where there might be some things that we're not so different about, so that from that little seed of common ground, we could then more respectfully explore the places where we differ from one another. So what this looks like in practice is a set of skills that go by a number of different names, but I think the easiest one to that many of you might have heard about is active listening or reflective listening. And so this is listening to what the person is saying, and then trying to ask clarifying questions that summarize what you're hearing. And especially it's helpful if you can label an emotion that you're hearing in what the person is saying. Like, it sounds like you're frustrated about how politics are going in Springfield these days. And then oh yeah, I'm frustrated. Or no, I'm not frustrated. And this allows for a back and forth within the conversation that allows me, as somebody who's chosen to take this stance, to get to a point where I can hear below the level of the provocations and the surface differences, to get to a place where I'm having a somewhat better understanding of what might be motivating those things. And at that level, there's a better chance to find something that we can use as a shared thread to move the conversation forward in a more productive way. So the first tactic is listening for understanding, not for advantage. A second tactic, which is related to the one that I just mentioned, is hunting for the common ground. So not only is it helpful to take a conversational stance where you're listening for understanding, but where you're also looking for hints, threads, mentions of things that could potentially be points where you and that person, maybe you're not in agreement, but you have some common ground that you as a conversation partner could identify as a way to build a closer rapport that would get to the point where you could have some of those more difficult conversations. And it turns out that hunting for the common ground is not so difficult if you have good listening skills. So that's why I put the other one first, because I can hear for emotional cues, or I can listen for things that are behind the complaints or the frustrations that are being expressed, and I can take a guess at what I'm hearing. I might say in one of my questions back to the person, well, it sounds like you're concerned about the quality of education these days. Is that right? And then if they say yes, well, that person and I might disagree about what the solutions are for the problems of education, but we might find that we both agree that there are ways that our education system could be improved, especially in higher ed. And that might be a starting point for exploring not only where we see things similarly, but then that would naturally lead to where we might diverge in our seeing. But having first explored the common ground would allow us to more safely, because we've demonstrated some mutual respect, or at least I've demonstrated respect for the other person, even if it's not reciprocated, to more naturally proceed to explore our differences in some ways that might be in a different place than if we started the conversations with, you believe that, I believe that, I don't see where we hold things in common. And one of the things that has been useful for me to keep in mind as I'm hunting for the common ground is a realization that what presents in a conversation or on the news as a very striking difference might actually have behind it something that is quite similar to something that I believe. And let me give you an example of that. So you can think about Democrats and Republicans maybe having concern about core values like equality or opportunity or freedom. But if the Democrat in a conversation ranks equality as the most important, and then second is opportunity, third is freedom, and the Republican in that conversation ranks freedom as the most important of those three values, and opportunity is second and equality is third, well, what gets presented is equality versus freedom, and we may not have a lot of common ground there, but within that ranking order, both of those conversation partners shared opportunity as the second most important thing, and ultimately, all three of the things that they hold important are shared values across those conversation partners, but they have to stop and take the time to explore whether that's the case and realize maybe in that case that what is showing up as difference and division is maybe just a differential prioritization of the things that are important. There may be a common pool of understanding and agreement, but it just isn't presenting in a way that would make it very accessible to explore. So looking for what's underneath in those conversations, hunting for the common ground is a useful tactic to try to do. Again, this is not something that for most people comes very naturally. It takes a lot of practice and patience and a lot of stifling of one's own emotional responses, and some people can manage that and some people really struggle with that. But the third tactic that I can leave you with, so the first is listening for understanding, not advantage. The second is hunting for common ground. The third one is what I call getting to the third why. And this is thinking about a series of questions where somebody says something to me, they're upset about something, and I might say back, ooh, I'm hearing that it sounds like you're pretty angry about this policy issue. Is that the case? Why, what is upsetting you so much? The first why. And then the person responds, well, I'm not angry, I'm just frustrated. Oh, okay. And talks about that. And then I'm hearing, okay, they're frustrated about something else. And we're at a little deeper level, but I want to understand a little bit more. So what about that something else leads you to be so frustrated? I'm not sure I understand the connection between your frustration and that thing that you just mentioned. And then a person would give a response. And I'd have a third opportunity to ask a clarifying question, why did you say this rather than that? Because I thought I heard you say that when our conversation started. Now I'm hearing something a little bit different. Can you help me understand how your concerns have shifted a little bit from where we started. If we can get through a sequence of asking me asking 3 why questions and getting 3 good responses, and the key is once again also labeling an emotion that I'm hearing in that response, and asking the why, because we all know, anybody who's parented small children, there are really annoying ways of asking the why question, right? And so the point is not to be annoying, but actually to validate what I think I'm hearing the other person feeling, not necessarily validating what they're saying. I might disagree vehemently with what they're saying, but if I can help them to identify what I'm hearing, their emotional loading of what they're saying, that can create some connection, and that might get us to the 3rd why. And I think if we get down to that level of having gone through 3 cycles of answering why questions, our conversation is going to be at a very different place than when we started. Our conversation is going to be at a place that is about some more core issues. Maybe we're not quite down all the way, but it's going to be a place where I have also, through those 3 cycles, I have listened enough that I can begin getting a hint of what some possible points of common ground might be for me and that conversation partner, and begin to explore. What sounds like you feel this way, I feel this way a little bit too. Can you share, what's your frustration with this thing? And that can be another point of exploration. So getting to the 3rd why is the 3rd tactic. The last one, and for League of Women Voters, I think is probably the most important, is recognizing that many of the partisan issues that divide us today are partisan issues at the level of national politics. All right, these are the culture war issues. These are major issues of foreign policy and taxation and environmental protection. But if we take that down to the level of local politics, suddenly those same issues may have a corollary at the local level, but they aren't going to present in quite the same way and quite the same level of antagonism as they will typically present at the national level. So the 4th tactic is taking it local. If you're in a difficult conversation politically and it's about the latest thing that's on MSNBC or Fox, or what some wild politician has said, trying to shift the topic to bring it down to the local level. Like, I'm really concerned about politics too, but the thing that is concerning me right now is the school board elections that's coming up in April 5th. And what do you think about that? Well, it might be that the person who's been expressing themselves very vehemently about national politics may not have thought a lot about what's going on at the local level. And suddenly there might be a space to talk about politics that isn't quite as freighted with all the partisan division as the national stuff is. And it also, I think, offers an opportunity for people who are normally divided on politics to agree that we would like to see fewer potholes in the streets. It's pothole season right now. What can we do about that? Everybody wants, I'm sure, to have schools that are doing a very effective job at teaching our kids. We want to have local government structures that are providing for the needs of our community. We want to live in safe and secure community. These are things that there's a lot of agreement that we could potentially explore as a way to back out, at least temporarily, from the big national issues that divide us, and see again if we can explore some common ground, this time at the local level, that will maybe provide more of a relational opportunity for down the road to explore the harder topics that are more challenging to start out with. So those are 4 tactics that you might find useful. I have definitely found useful in talking about difficult issues, not just difficult issues in politics, difficult issues with teenagers. These are great for all of those. But again, the main takeaway is, if you're trying to win in that conversation, you're going to lose unless you are having as a conversation partner somebody who's an extraordinarily good at interpersonal skills. So that's what I brought you on this topic, and I'm happy to turn it back to the moderators and explore whatever other things might be interesting to talk about.
Thank you, Scott. Those are very good reminders, and I think, as you said, it's maybe easy to listen to your recommendations, but actually practicing them is much more difficult. So we thought that for the format of this program that we would try to spend as much time as possible just having Scott answer your questions. And he's very happily agreed to do that. we have received a number of questions in advance. But if you have a burning question, we'd just ask that you put it in the chat, and then I'll call on you. And just as a reminder, if you're called upon, be sure and unmute yourself so we can hear your question. And we are going to, as you know, this program ends at 8, so we're going to try to pack as many questions in as possible between now and 8 p.m. So I'm going to start with Ann Prislin. Ann, you had a really good question related to trying to accommodate two-way communication. If you would ask that question, please. And be sure, again, unmute yourself.
Sure, I'll be glad to. Thank you, Scott, for being here. I was struck by something someone said at the town hall, that if you do your best to listen to understand, your first tactic, that you will find that the other person will begin to do that for you as well. Well, my experience has been that even though I do my best to listen and ask open-ended questions and try to stay away from sort of the why that's asked the wrong way, my listening approach is often or rarely reciprocated. Mm-hmm. And I'm a little frustrated with that. So the person holding different political views doesn't seem at all interested in learning any more about me and my thoughts. So there's no way to really get that conversation going anywhere. So what else can I do when my best efforts don't seem at all to be reciprocated?
That is a great question and a very appropriate question for this topic. So there are some resources that I provided to our moderators that will be distributed, I think, through the chat link later in our conversation. And there's an article in the Washington Post that gives some tips and tactics that address the question that you raised. So I want to just put a finger on that and say you might want to look at that later. I think part of the reality, though, is that many people are exactly as you described. They're really not interested in exploring those differences, and in part because we're living in a season in American politics that is driven by a great deal of negative emotion. The good news is there have been many seasons in American politics where this has been the case, and we've survived it so far. But the hard thing is that when the differences are not just about ideas or different preferences that people have, but are also caught up in identities and in a lot of emotional loading. And never before in human history have we been exposed to the amount of emotive content that is coming to us through a highly mediated system today. So it is a very difficult season for anyone to calm down enough to who cares about something like politics to be able to engage in these conversations. And so I think partly my response is, yeah, for some people it's probably not going to happen until some other things change. But I don't give up hope on that, because what the persuasion literature shows pretty clearly in the academic research is that relational context is one of the biggest factors for helping people come to a different view than the one that they started out with. So if you're in relationship with somebody that is not just, hey, how you doing? And then you're walking past, but there's something else that's connecting you together, that can serve as a resource to, over time, develop a better capacity for reciprocal curiosity. But right now, the social media system in particular is monetizing outrage. And so that is a whole system that is designed to keep us hopped up and angry and concerned and frustrated, because that moves a lot of advertising dollars, and that's going to really interfere with our ability to navigate these challenges. But relational context and patience in relationship is one of the factors that 70 plus years of persuasion literature suggests can be a really important ingredient in helping somebody to see things in a different light.
Thank you. Linda Miner, if you had a question you had submitted.
Yes, thanks, Scott, and I appreciate your 4 tactics. But just to build on that a little bit more, regardless where a person leans political beliefs, how can one talk with those whose views seem to be threatening our democracy without appearing judgmental or imposing their own views on them? Would you tweak those 4 tactics any, or add anything on whenever it's threatening our democracy?
So the stakes, not just in the United States, but across the world today, in terms of potential for democratic backsliding, are much higher than they've been globally in at least 60 or 70 years, which isn't forever, but it's been a long time. And certainly in the United States, I think you'd have to go back to maybe the 1820s to get to a season where concern about commitment to core principles of what most of us understand is what democracies are about are really being questioned. And so this is a season that is politically dangerous for the United States, and I think it's important for us to recognize that. And as a political scientist, the hallway conversations in my department are not all peaches and cream. Let me tell you that, okay? But it's also the case that depending on where we're coming from on the political spectrum, and what particular political identities are important to us, there might be a pretty large gap between what the threat to democracy is, right? And so we can think about a lot of legislation to roll back voting rights and to restrict access to the ballot as being a threat to democracy, and especially one that resonates with the Democratic side of the spectrum. But on the Republican side of the spectrum, from what I understand, there is an equally deep concern about the present state of democracy, a concern that it is being captured by interest groups and by elites in ways that are really inauthentic to how this country was founded. And so one of the challenges then, and I'm coming to an answer to your question, Linda, one of the challenges is that I don't think any one political side has a lock on being concerned about threats to democracy right now. And so it's hard to navigate that, because the stakes have objectively risen, not just because I feel a lot of emotion because I'm on social media or watching Fox and MSNBC, but the stakes are higher. I think that means that the stakes are also higher for those of us who care about democracy to try to pick up some of these skills and to be able to build bridges with people who think differently. And one of the things that I was very encouraged about with the event that Carol mentioned of several weeks ago was this is a room in our town that brought together over 200 people who clearly represent the political right and the political left. And they were animated by a shared concern for how we're doing, which doesn't seem very good right now as a society in democratic politics. And so I do think that there is a lot of potential to find that common ground that's going to help us even navigate these difficult things. I think, though, that one of the challenges, and again, back to the question that you asked, Linda, is that there may be a very divergent understanding of the factual basis for some of these concerns about whether democracy is threatened or not. And unfortunately, we've gotten into a point where our media system rewards cheap opinion rather than expensive accountability reporting. And so we get a lot of vocal bloviating that happens on all sides of the political spectrum about things that are going wrong and what the problems seem to be that may not be well anchored in the version of reality that most of us would choose to walk in. And the Dominion voting lawsuit that's working its way up through the court system right now is a great example of how that plays out within the media system. So probably a longer answer than you expected, Linda, but it's a really important question, and the stakes are indeed high for us right now.
Thank you, Scott. We do have a number of questions related to the media, so we're going to get to that in 1 minute. But before we move on, another question that was asked: when political polarization is entrenched around religious and cultural beliefs, how is it possible to move past this?
Well, let's that makes it harder, right? So it's hard that we have a media system that's amping us up, and it's hard that many of us have either identities that are important to us, or firm commitments to religious traditions or cultural traditions that have become expressed in a way that has become very politically polarized as well. And I'm a Christian myself, and so I've looked on with some increasing level of concern over the last 20 years to see how Christianity has been politicized in the way that we see it now in these really extreme expressions of Christian nationalism and so on. So I think, though, that one of the ways that we can navigate through this, it'll take a little effort on your part to do, but to figure out what is the cultural or religious impingement that seems to be anchoring some of these concerns, and do a bit of research. I'm a professor, and so I'm a big advocate of doing some research. And let's take the case of Christianity and politics. And today, I think the conventional wisdom is that white Christians tend to skew lopsidedly to the Republicans. And that is true. That is there's survey after survey that shows that. But the conversation usually stops at that point and doesn't bring up another important fact. Non-white Christians don't. Non-white Christians skew to the Democrats. And so if you're trying to understand, well, what is the anchoring role of Christianity in sort of Republican political identity, it's actually a very complicated story. And if you are able to do a little research about that, to see that there are extremely divergent religious traditions that would agree theologically and doctrinally on, the same things, but they're expressing themselves differently in politics, then we have to ask ourselves, why do Black Christians vote Democrat, but white Christians vote Republican? Well, and there's an answer to that. And it turns out that has to do with some important mobilization that the Republican Party was doing in the 1980s. And this isn't about that topic. I go on a long time, but here's what I can take you back to. If you want, for religious stuff, especially with Christianity, but all religions, there is a professor on Twitter whose name is Ryan Burge, B-U-R-G-E. Find him on Twitter if you're on Twitter. He may have he's got a book out. I don't know what the title is, but he is the data maestro of religion and politics in the United States. And I'm actually looking at a graph of his that looks at the partisanship of weekly churchgoers in the United States. And do you know that this relationship between Christians and, white Christians and Republican partisanship only starts showing up in the late 1980s? That if you go back to the late 1970s, the modal political expression for a white Christian was Democrat. And so again, we have to ask, okay, what's going on with that? Well, some things have changed, but it might help if I'm talking with somebody who holds to Christian beliefs. It might help to bring to light some of this history that they might not know about, that actually there is no long-standing connection between Christianity and the Republican Party in the United States. It is a very recent development in the last 30 years. And so we might want to explore together how things looked before the 1980s and what was it about the 1980s. And I'll give you the hint. It was the mobilization into anti-abortion rights as a tactic to build an electoral coalition. That was also at the same time happening as a shift in the South, which had been lopsidedly Democratic for eons, went Republican on the basis of civil rights issues. Okay, and so here's where we get the inklings of race and culture war stuff starting to separate the different constituencies for these parties, but it's a very recent thing. And I think if more Christians, again, that's the example that I know well, if more Christians were aware of how recent these connections are, that might lead them to ask a few more questions and to explore a little bit more deeply about, what is it about Christianity and politics? Does it make sense for there to be some perceived natural connection with one party or another?
Hey, Anne, Priscilla, again, you had another question related to having conversations around facts or non-facts.
Or not, yeah, exactly. Disagreement about what is the fact, huh? Well, I find maybe like others that I'm often in conversations with people who continually state false information. And I mean, I don't mean false, it's my opinion, but I mean actual false. Here's an example. I was having a disagreement with someone. It had something to do with Social Security. I don't even remember now. And I was pretty sure I was correct, but I said, why don't we just look it up? You know, we'll go to the Social Security website, look it up, let's see what they said. So the correct answer was there. And this other person still would not accept that answer as accurate. And I just didn't know what to do at that point. There was nowhere else I felt I could go because it wasn't my saying it, it was the actual administration. So what do you do when you get to what in my mind was kind of a dead end? I didn't know what else to do.
Okay, so let's picture ourselves going to the doctor's office and you're diagnosed with a pinky problem and you don't know anything about pinky problems, and you ask the doctor, what should I do for the pinky problem? And the doctor says, well, it's surgery or this medicine. And surgery sounds awful. So will the medicine work? I asked. The doctor says, yes, it'll work. I said, okay, give me the medicine. I'm going to take it. That little vignette is how we interact with facts and politics. In the end, most of us, even though I could have walked away from that doctor's office and gone to Google and done the research and see whether surgery or the pinky medicine was going to work for me, I don't have a lot of time to do that. I don't think I've got a great medical opinion to start with, and so I'm going to trust the doctor and let that and hopefully that's going to work, and if not, I'll find another doctor. It turns out that's pretty much how people navigate the factual world in politics, just like the rest of the spaces that we occupy. And so what that means is that the core anchoring point for many people, especially today in their political beliefs, is not the factual accuracy of the information that they have, but it's rather, do they trust the person or the institution or the organization that's providing that information? It's trust, just like trust in the doctor's office. Mm-hmm. So if you want to get to the point where somebody can begin asking questions about the facts, often the more important barrier is that they just don't trust sources that aren't already identified to them as being reliable. And we can then ask the question, well, what makes that for a reliable source? And these days, especially for people who are more polarized on the partisan spectrum, then that's typically going to mean the kind of TV shows with lots of shouty heads on it, or the social media stuff that's really exploding on my phone, and I'm sharing things with all my friends because I'm so outraged. And so it's really trust is the issue. And so I don't have any quick solutions to the trust problem, but here's something that I think is still pretty distinctive in our media system that is important to keep in mind. In most parts of the mainstream media, think about any of the prominent examples: New York Times, Washington Post, government agencies, not the media system, but increasingly what they say is important for the information that we get. If somebody presents information that is factually untrue, and especially if it's egregiously untrue, there are parts of our media system where they will be fired for that. They will lose their job. There are other parts of the media system where they are rewarded for that, it appears. And again, we can talk about what parts of the media system that might be. But I think it certainly matters to me, as somebody who doesn't know anything about anything, that if somebody from this outlet says a false thing and they're caught, that they're going to lose their livelihood, not just in that outlet, but it's going to be a reputational problem for them to get hired anywhere else. Whereas this other part of our media space that doesn't seem to be a problem, then that might be a starting point to begin wondering if maybe I could pay a little closer attention to the facts in that other outlet. But in the end, I think that what is objectionable to people politically isn't the facts or claims about the accuracy of the facts. It's the story that you tell about the facts. It's what context are you putting the facts in, and that's where the story may matter more to many of us and many people that we interact with than the actual validity of the facts, because you can find other facts that probably would allow you to support your own process of confirmation bias, but what's the story that's told about those facts is where some of those larger anchoring points are. And that's also what makes it hard to present one fact and say, well, this isn't aligned with, you know, your belief. That may not be very dispositive to somebody who's really more anchored in narrative, in the stories that are being told politically, than about the bits of evidence that support the narrative. Yeah, it's hard. It's a hard season we're in.
Probably the most recent example that's become very public are media's personalities that have said one thing publicly, and then we find out that they have the totally opposite point of view privately. And it really, you know, it's very damaging in terms of trust of the media. So anyway, we will transition into media just because it seems that for many people, they feel like that really has contributed greatly to our polarization. And Joan Towsey, I think you had a question, maybe starting looking at our local media, and then we'll talk a little bit more about national.
Thanks, Sarah. So unfortunately, I missed the town hall meeting because I was spending time with grandchildren in, of all places, Florida. We won't even talk about the politics in Florida and all the cultural issues there. But related to media, our local sources cover a variety of political leanings and maybe some more than other. But what is your assessment of the balance in our community and perhaps how it seems to impact conversations around political issues?
Yeah, that's a huge question, important question. And local news media all around the country are threatened right now, are under great economic stress. And we are, as a country and as a community, going to be much worse off if we do not have a healthy system of accountability journalism in place to help keep our leaders' feet to the fire in ways that ordinary citizens often struggle to do. So it's very important to understand not only the health of our local news ecosystem, but also to understand its important characteristics and properties. And so we can think about three dominant models of journalism that have occupied this country since the beginning. One is, think about a referee or an umpire, and that's called the social responsibility or trustee model. That's the one where objectivity is separated from opinions, and we're only going to talk about the facts, and the journalist is going to call out bad facts and say you're wrong on that. And that's a familiar form of journalism. Another form of journalism is an advocacy model of journalism. Think about the prosecutor or the defender in a courtroom, and they're trying to make their respective cases to a judge or to a jury. And they're going to be forceful advocates for their side. And the idea there is that the jury or the judge, you know, hears which is the better argument and judges on that basis. But that advocacy model of news is what we see today in Fox and MSNBC and lots of other places in this country. And then there's more of a market-driven model, like whatever people want, give it to them. If they want stories about squirrels on water skis, well, then that's what they want. And who are we as journalists to say that we should give them something different from that? So these three models have been in tension. They're always in tension, but some of them have been more dominant than others over different parts of time. And one of the things that we're seeing right now is a change in the dominance of that social responsibility, the umpire model of what the news is. That's on the decline. And the advocacy model and the market models, they're on the upswing right now. That is not let's run for the hills because democracy is doomed. That is actually, in the long history of the United States, what statisticians call regression to the mean. That is, we're returning to normal. This period where objectivity has reigned is a real oddity in the long history of the United States. So taking it back to the local level, what does that mean for us? Well, the local newspaper, the News Gazette, is our one example. We used to have the Urbana Courier, but it's not around anymore except for breakfast these days. The local newspaper still has all three of those models built into it. The front section is the umpire version of social responsibility journalism. The editorial and the op-ed, or the opposite, the editorial pages columnists, that's the advocacy model right there. And then the high school confidential section and sports and weather, that's the market model, right? And so we have all three of those in the paper, but what is confusing for many of us who haven't sat through journalism 101 classes, or who don't, have the experience of working in journalism, is that journalists think that all of us understand that the front pages are totally separate from the editorial stances and the opinion columnists, and those are totally separate from everything else. But when I'm reading the paper, one page flows to the next, and it looks like I'm seeing lots of opinions mixed in with the straight news. So our local News Gazette, just like other local communities with daily newspapers around, still adhere to this model where there's a big part of the news that's supposed to be that fair empire calling the shots. And then there's this other part where advocates can reign. And there's this other part where lots of other things happen. And so I would think that when we ask the question in terms of balance, that's actually not, that's not a starting point that's aligned with how journalists think about their own work. Even though the word balance is often put into view professionally, the norms that journalists follow are not balance as if 50-50 Republican Democrat, but rather to make sure that not that one voice or one perspective is not dominant within your straight news story. So you need to have some alternative perspective in there, but even if it's the last paragraph, that still kind of counts as fitting the objectivity norm as professional journalists understand it. That all makes for a very confusing read for those of us who don't know all those things and aren't familiar with those conventions. But it does suggest to me, as somebody who's followed the News Gazette closely, and I don't mean to pick on one of our news outlets, we have many of them, that they still follow, the conventional wisdom on these three models. And depending on where you're looking on the paper, you're going to get one version or the other. It doesn't mean that news organizations are perfect. I've had my complaints with the News Gazette. And I've also cheered them on many occasions. But I think if we step back from the local newspaper, we also can appreciate that our local news environment is much more nuanced and more complex than that. So we have television news. We have this oddity in our town that the top ratings leader in one of the top media markets in the United States, the top third at least, is hometown in Champaign-Urbana. And so we get local news on TV. Like, doesn't everybody get that? No, that doesn't happen. So that's a really rich part of our local information environment. We've got Smile Politely, we've got the Independent Media Center, we've got other organizations, we've got still weeklies once in a while that are trying to struggle through to get some other perspectives out there. So we have a fairly rich, and then there's Nextdoor and lots of other things, which, whatever you make of that. So we have a fairly rich information environment. I don't think the question that I would ask is it balanced, this local information environment? My question would be, is it diverse? Can people find a range of different perspectives and have the ability to assess whether those perspectives are credible or not? And that's what I like about the old objectivity version of journalism is, again, it's a fireable offense to step out of the bounds of what's appropriate journalism in that model. And that gives me some confidence that when I read something, I should pay attention to it.
Related to then maybe pulling this together, Jane Santagrossi had a question about about higher education and how you are training your students and also future journalists. So Jane, if you want to ask those questions you have.
So yeah, we're just kind of curious that you have these classrooms full of students and you're trying to presumably teach them the same thing that you're telling us tonight. I assume it's like a little encapsulated model. I mean, do they practice and do they come to you with their issues, trying to talk to people that don't share their views? How does that work?
So my role in the classroom is really to provide students with a basic understanding of how systems operate. In media and politics, it's journalism systems, but it's other things. What are the economic factors that drive the provision of information? What are the audience factors that provide? What are the opportunities that get sought out by news providers and so on? And at that level, the topics are dry as dirt sometimes, right? It's not, these are not politically loaded topics. This is sort of how a bill becomes a law, except we're talking about the news media, right? And so there is most of the content that I cover in my classes is not politically loaded or all that controversial. I'm trying to help my students pick up some information that will be useful for them as citizens and useful for our country if more people knew about that and could apply it. And also to try to instill in my students the value of not only being critical consumers of the information they receive, but to be active producers of knowledge from that information. So what I hear from students is, in my classrooms, we don't have a lot of difficult conversations. Sometimes we do. And I think one of the biggest challenges that I have in navigating through a difficult conversation is that often there's 100 students in the room, and it's not just me and one person having that conversation. It's a whole group that is rolling eyes and pulling their phones out and all that stuff. So it's hard in that environment. But what I find is that students are really eager to better understand how these systems operate, because they have suspicions about how they operate, and some of those suspicions are right and some are not right. So have I answered your question with that?
Yeah, this isn't what you teach all day long. You teach other things, and this might come up.
Well, I teach a class on politics and media. And so, we talk about that. I'm teaching a class right now called Campaigning to Win, which is how political consultants do their thing to win elections. And I have the class divided into Republican teams and Democratic teams, and they're strategizing for the next governor race in Illinois and the Senate race next year in Wisconsin. So these are live issues and live topics. But the level that we're approaching this is, much more about, like, how do I analyze the vote returns from the county level, and not so much, how we do with it in politics. But I have found that students are very curious to hear from voices that are different from the main ones that you get through social media and through MSNBC and Fox. And so I hope that the learning environment that I try to create in my classrooms give them that opportunity to hear something different. They're hungry for it.
So how can non-students become critical consumers of media? Because that seems to be one of the issues, is that most people are not.
Right. And so there again, we have a problem of politics. And the problem of politics is, and going back to the trust issue that was raised earlier. So if you look at opinion trends in the United States on trust in governing institutions and the media and Congress and all these things, trust is just going down over, no surprise, right? It used to be in the 1960s, trust in institutions was pretty good, and now it's really hit the tanks. But along with that, there has been a partisan split in trust that has opened up over the last couple of decades, because on the Republican side, trust has been used politically to activate support for Republican causes and candidates. There's a different way that trust manifests and trust concerns manifest on the Democratic side, but I'm mentioning the Republican side because when you look at current measures on, do you trust mainstream media? Do you trust National Public Radio? Do you trust any, what we would think of as conventional institutions of journalism? What we've seen over time is that Republicans as a whole are becoming not only less trusting of those media sources, but they're also disengaging from them. Whereas Democrats aren't dropping off quite as rapidly as Republicans. So that means it's really difficult for us to become critical consumers of this news environment. It's easier right now for Democrats actually to be critical consumers of the news environment, because the data show that Democrats are just more still invested in the mainstream institutions. And so that allows for the average Democrat to probably have a higher proportion of their information diet coming from these more umpire type of journalistic sources, but not uniformly so. And so, advocacy news on the left is just as popular as advocacy news on the right. But it means that it's going to be very difficult to, if you're on the political right, there's a huge trust issue that is just going to be a big barrier to becoming a good consumer of these spaces. So with that said, there's still some recommendations that I can give. And one is to keep the heck off of your phone. Right? Don't go to social media for news information. Don't go to Facebook and Twitter and TikTok, and Twitch is now a news. I don't know if any of you have gamers in your family, but Twitch is now a news source for a lot of people. Like, get off of those sites and try to not only go to more conventional, reputable news sources, but there's a particular subset of those news sources that that people are less likely to find objectionable across the political spectrum. And that is local news, local television news in particular, but local newspapers. That is wire service news. So you can, the one app that I've got on my phone that I would recommend for news is the Associated Press Wire, which you can get for free. And Associated Press pitches it down the middle. So that's useful. So wire services, local news, local television news is going to be a little bit more market driven. Newspapers are often a little bit better, but the other place to go is outside the United States. So if you want to know what's happening in the US, go to BBC World. Go to The Dawn, which is the Pakistani version of the New York Times. It's in English. Go to Haaretz in Israel. Go to the South China Morning Post which is in southern China, to get a Chinese perspective, and to see how American politics is being refracted through media systems that are not politically involved in all the drama that's happening right here. They are going to have their own political leanings in many cases, but a more diverse news diet, especially involving news sources from outside the United States, is going to equip us to have a much better grasp of, okay, even if it's getting kind of wild inside the United States, what are people in other countries saying? Canada has an amazing public service news broadcasting system. Go to CBC and find out what they have to say about American politics. And I think that is a starting point. Local news, wire services, and then reputable news outlets from outside the United States that can be a good starting point for people across the political spectrum to try to get into a news diet. The problem with that last one is, especially through social media, there are outside the United States news outlets that appear reputable, and they are not. And I'm thinking of RT and Sputnik in particular, which are Russian propaganda outlets, and they are very highly targeting American audiences with straight up propaganda for the most part. So we do have to be careful, but again, going to reputable sources, and one of the ways to check those reputable sources is to go online and to see what are the most popular news sources around the world. That's where the BBC Worlds are going to start rising to the surface, and you can get a sense of probably what's a little bit more credible than others.
Well, this has been amazing, and obviously we did not get to all our questions, but it is 8 o'clock almost, and I'm going to turn it back over to Carol. But Scott, thank you so much, and I think we could probably go for another hour, but we won't ask you to do that or expect others to stay on. So Carol, I think you have some closing comments.
Sure. I put in the chat Scott's email, Sarah's email, and my email if you wanted to contact us for any reason. Also in the chat is a League of Women Voters link. If anyone attending is not a League member, wants to learn more about the League, or even maybe consider joining it, you can always you can join online right from the website. And also in the chat is the Braver Angels national website. They offer some excellent skills-based workshops that are free, that are online, and that are excellent. And they're facilitated by trained, excellent facilitators. You don't have to be a member of Braver Angels to take them. And many of us in the Braver Angels Alliance have taken them, and we can tell you they're very good. You can join the Braver Angels if you want, but you don't have to take the workshops. To join Braver Angels is only $12 a year, by the way. Our Braver Angels Alliance meeting meets the third Thursday of each month. If you want to be contacted about the next meeting, just contact Sarah or me, and we'll add you to the email list. Scott has provided some resources, and they're also in the chat room. So if you wanted to take a bit of time to jot those down before we close up, we'll stay on for a bit. I think that's it. And I echo what Sarah said. Scott, thank you so much for spending an hour with us. This has been a very informative and useful, keeping it local, and we appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
You are very welcome.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everyone, for attending.